We talked last week about modernism and David Jones. You may remember I quoted Virginia Woolf, one of the most important theorists of modernism, who said that the proper stuff of fiction is an ordinary mind on an ordinary day. In parenthesis is an important book not just for its technical innovation and aesthetic pleasures, but because it contains such a compelling description of an ordinary soldier's experiences in the trenches. That is part of what made All Quiet compelling as well, and part of the reason the Forbidden Zone resonates with readers. In all these texts, we get to encounter and begin to understand the experiences of people we can relate to, people who we may see as like us, ordinary people who want to do their best, but who may not perceive themselves as extraordinarily brave or as superstars. If we think about Mary Borden for a moment, we can understand her and the various protagonists of her texts as willing, capable, empathetic, and we can see what happens when a regular woman like her is confronted with the mass horror of the Great War. When we think about the Great War, we often think about the combatant nations as Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire against Britain, France, and Russia, and that's true. But if we remember back to the first week of class, we mentioned that each of these nations had an empire. Even Belgium had imperial possessions in Africa, and that each nation called on its colonized people to fight on its behalf. We should recognize then that the ordinary of the Western Front was not purely a European phenomenon, but involved people from all over the world. In November 2018, I gave a lecture to commemorate the centenary of the Great War's end, and in the audience was a Texas Tech faculty member whose grandfather had been an Australian soldier fighting in the trenches in Flanders, which reminded me how few steps we are from the war. If any of you have Canadian friends or professors, they are almost certain to be able to tell stories of family members who fought or were lost in the Great War. In fact, one way that Americans fought before the U.S. entered the war in 1917 was by joining Canadian regiments, because those regiments fought for Britain as if they were themselves British. Now, in the case of Canada, the nation's people had then and continue to have a close relationship to the United Kingdom, because Canada is what is called a settler colony, like the United States, where people from another nation came and pushed aside or killed the native people to become a majority with ties to a home country. Australia and New Zealand are like that too. The indigenous populations were decimated, and the new majority were people with ties to Europe. It makes sense that someone who had recently immigrated from England might feel compelled to fight for their former home, and even that someone whose grandmother lived in England might want to do so. It makes less sense that people from countries in the middle of trying to attain freedom from their colonial overlords would want to do so. And yet citizens of India, Ireland, the Belgian Congo, Senegal, German colonies in Africa, even China, ended up fighting in a European war whose ultimate rationale was to divide the remaining scraps of the earth among European colonial powers. The case of Ireland illustrates the problem. Britain had been colonial rulers in Ireland for hundreds of years before the Great War. During that time, they had forbidden the Irish language, pushed the dominant religion, Roman Catholicism, into second-class status, dissolved the Irish Parliament so that laws were made for Ireland in London by British lawmakers, and organized land ownership rules to benefit absentee British landlords. The land ownership rules, by the way, are what caused the death or immigration of half the population of Ireland during the potato famine. During that time, the Irish people were starving, but they were also exporting food to Britain. They had to, in order to pay the exorbitant rents their British absentee landlords demanded. That's also why they grew only potatoes as a staple crop, making them utterly dependent on that crop and devastated when it failed. Needless to say, the Irish were not big fans of the exploitative rule England enacted in their territory. They had made one attempt after another over the centuries to try to end British rule and gain self-government. But because of poverty in Ireland, a result of British policies there, Ireland had always been an important source of soldiers for the British Army, and that was no different in the Great War. Of course, once conscription came in, Irishmen were drafted just as Englishmen, Scots, and Welshmen were. But even in the early years of the war, the British government devoted substantial resources to convincing potential Irish recruits that the truly Irish thing to do was to join the British Army. Irish soldiers fought and died in all the major battles of the war. At the same time, at Easter 1916, Irish rebels tried to obtain guns from Germany in support of their armed resistance to the British government. India was similarly placed. The British had been rulers there since the 18th century, and by the 20th century, Indians were pretty tired of what this meant for them. Earlier attempts to overthrow British rule had been harshly repressed. Once the war came along, Britain could not afford to have colonial fronts as well as the European one, so their governance of their possessions became harsher, even as they encouraged colonial soldiers to fight for them by offering better treatment to them and their families. Indian soldiers were known as some of the fiercest and ablest fighters in the British Army, particularly elite units like the Gurkhas. If you get the opportunity to travel in the war area, you can visit Commonwealth War Grave Commission cemeteries and see Indian names and religious symbols on many headstones. The Chinese Labor Corps, too, while primarily deployed to carry loads and construct things, suffered heavy losses on the Western Front, including during the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918-1919, which particularly affected them because much of their work was near hospitals. Thinking about these soldiers and laborers can help us expand the sense of the ordinary we get from David Jones. Western Europe during the time of the war was a polyglot, multi-ethnic place, weirdly divided into combatant forces, but actually exhibiting the cosmopolitanism that is a key feature of modernism. When we think about why modernity demanded innovations in art in order to express accurately the new social, political, and historical realities, scholars usually invoke technology as a key driver, and technology helped to consolidate people in cities, a shift that is still happening now. Jones represents the nightmare world of warfare, but a world that is a palimpsest of the urban world of modernity. Objects in the trenches, such as the bully beef in tins eaten by the troops, carries brand names so that soldiers can compare varieties of army rations. Trenches are named for streets in London, and of course, the cockneys in the unit are never really far from home. Meanwhile, being in the Army enables travel, though not really of the tourist variety, and mixing with those who have had more expansive lives than the working-class city dwellers John Ball would have known before the war. Although Ball's battalion consists of Londoners, they mix with officers and soldiers of the Indian Army. When soldiers are frightened or anxious, they talk of ordinary things, and you feel a bit less windy. Making the war ordinary helps soldiers adapt. When the shelling is intense, they might remark a certain liveliness in the air. Because the section of the book you read for today is the run-up to and beginning of the Battle of Mametz Wood, there is a lot for the soldiers to be wary of. Battles in World War I, by the time of the Somme, would have been preceded by a lengthy bombardment of the enemy lines, meant to make the attack easier by softening resistance and cutting the barbed wire. Of course, we know that the generals discovered during the Somme that this didn't always go to plan. The German dugouts were deep, and its army survived the bombardment relatively intact, and British troops who made it to the other side of no man's land invariably found that intense shelling had had no effect on the barbed wire emplacements. What the constant shelling did have an effect on was the nerves of the soldiers, so that by the time the attack happened, ordinary men like Ball had already suffered so much they could scarcely function. As Jones says, the surfeit of fear steadies to dumb incognition. That's the scene when Part 7 begins. Ball is already catatonic from apprehension, and the events of the day don't do much to dispel that. When the man next to him tries to encourage him with, "Get ready, me china plate," he is immediately struck, but Ball notes that it is a cushy one, that is, a wound bad enough to get you out of the line of battle, but not so serious you have to fear death, and that his friend is relaxing to the morning sun and waiting for stretcher-bearers smilingly. Ball does as he ought, marching forward on command, seeing his comrades killed and wounded, launching a hand grenade successfully into underbrush where he thinks the enemy is lurking. When he himself is struck, see page 183, his first thought is that the mechanisms of war are disproportionate given how fragile human beings are. As he seeks to return to his own lines for medical treatment, we see the reemergence of the ordinary in the extraordinary scene of battle. Ball's instinct is to lay down his rifle, because its length and weight make it hard for him to crawl toward help. This instinct conflicts with his military training, that one should consider one's rifle not a tool of war, but the soldier's best friend, who one should marry and cherish because she's your very own. We've heard this metaphor before in Sassoon's poem The Kiss, and every military recruit has also heard this language used as armies throughout the world try to overcome new soldiers' sense of self-preservation with responses that are more likely to achieve military objectives. In the end, Rifle, Private Ball, a dead German, and a dead sergeant all lie together under the yoke, as the poem ends ambiguously. Certainly, readers can understand that the war is very little about heroism and glory. Rather, we end up with this small human moment when John Ball waits for either a stretcher or death, seeming indifferent to which comes for him. Ball is no longer even trying to be a soldier. He is a human being, small, ineffective, a matter of no concern to the great events swirling around him. And of course, this puts the great events into perspective too. Jones is writing 20 years in the future, a position from which he could well look back and think about the significance of the battle, the meaning of the war. But he does not pull out to that vantage point, instead returning to his ancient Welsh story, gaining new understanding of its heroes, as his own anti-hero lies still on the field.